Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to announce the opening of the 60th International Conference of Music and Mathematics, Musmat 2012, for the second time on online format. This year we pay tribute to the great composer and theoretician Arnold Schoenberg, who has left us 70 years ago. His legacy is the subject of several lectures that will be presented in the conference. An extraordinary number of guests of the highest level and recognized worldwide expertise will provide us with lectures and discussions that will certainly be greatly appreciated by all. We will have also 5 concerts, including Schoenberg's compositions, as well as many original works. I wish you all an excellent conference. Boa tarde a todos. Tenho o prazer de anunciar a abertura do 6º Congresso Internacional de Música e Matemática, Musmat 2021, pela segunda vez em formato online. Este ano prestamos homenagem ao grande compositor e teórico Arnold Schoenberg, que nos deixou há 70 anos. Seu legado é tema de várias palestras que serão apresentadas no Congresso. Um número extraordinário de convidados do mais alto nível e reconhecida expertise mundial nos proporcionarão palestras e debates que certamente serão muito apreciados por todos. Teremos também 5 concertos, incluindo composições de Schoenberg, além de muitas obras originais. Desejo a todos um excelente congresso. Obrigado pela assistência.
Hi, everyone. Now we will pass through some activities of the conference, beginning with the lectures. Today at 3 p.m. we will have a conference of Walter Frisch of the Columbia University talking about Schoenberg's creativity journey, more specifically his 15 years in the beginning of his career. Tomorrow, the second day of the conference, we will have 2 conferences. The first one by Guilherme Bueno, professor of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, who will talk about another aspect of Schoenberg art, that is his paintings. And at 6 p.m., we will have a talk by Jack Boss of the University of Oregon, and he will talk about symmetry in the Schoenberg's Opus 33A. This music will also be played in the concert of the Friday. And the following day, we will have Edgardo Rodrigues and Alejandro Martinez from Universidad Nacional de La Plata. And they will talk more specifically about Schoenberg Opus 11, number 3. And the day 4, we will have Jeffrey Perry from Louisiana State University talking about works that Schoenberg developed in the United States. And to close our conference, we have a lecture by Dominique Chevidi from Richard Strauss Institute that he will talk about a compositional technique developed by Hauer and his student, and formally applied by his students.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Now we're going to talk about the roundtables for the conference. Today we have a roundtable, the first one about Schoenberg's music and his compositional process. We have Carlos Almada from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Flo Menezes from UNESP, and State University of São Paulo, and Achille Picchi from UNESP too. They will talk about the way Schoenberg works his composition with discussing Grundgestalt development variation, the harmony and its color, and some examples of his music. So in the next day, the day 2, tomorrow, we have a round table. Okay, no, it's before, day 2. Yes, okay. About the decaphonism and beyond, and we have Robert Morris from Eastman School of Music, speaking about form and process in Schoenberg's piano piece Opus 23, number 3. Sabine Feist from Arizona University, talking about the dissemination of manifestation of the decaphonic in the second period of 20th century music and 21st century. And Gianluca Scaccioli, from an independent researcher, we're going to talk about Alberto Scola and Cotinitas, sorry. The day 3, we have a roundtable about Schoenberg and analytical process with Professor Ethan Heimel from Bar-Ilan University, talking about Schoenberg mathematics and the 4th string quartet. Severin Neff from University of North Carolina, we're going to talk about Werke, Bach, Schoenberg, and symmetry. And Nathan Dudek from Federal University of Paraná, we're going to talk about 3 techniques for motivic thematics on Schoenberg and his application in analytical process. And in the day 4, on Thursday, we have a roundtable on Schoenberg and group theory with Robert Peck from Louisiana State University, talking about Schoenberg's inversional combinatorial space. Cecilia Saraiva from Unirio going to talk about the decaphonism from homotopy from fundamental group on Schoenberg's music, especially in the 12-tone music. And Mark Feitosa going to talk about Schoenberg and group theory, an intervallic approach to tone row, symmetry, and combinatoriality. And the last day, we'll have the last roundtable on Schoenberg and set theory with Marcelo Birch from Federal University of Santa Maria. We're going to talk about collective creation in a multimedia space for the analysis for Opus 19.6 of Schoenberg in a pedagogical experience. Ricardo Borrodini from Federal University of, I forgot MA, what does it mean? We're going to talk about numbers and Schoenberg scholar, and Luigi Verdi from Conservatorio Santa Cecilia di Roma. We're going to talk about Tilling 6-part double canons on trichords.
Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our conference. My name is Carlos Matias. I'm going to talk about the panels that will occur in our event. So on day 3, that is Wednesday, at 3:30, we'll have the first panel of the Congress that will deal with the students' research under development. So we will receive several graduate and undergraduate students, among which Ariane Petri, Pedro Zizels, Ana Micolis, Roberto Macedo, Felipe de Matos Rocha, Igor Chagas, Pedro Proença, Max Kahn, Rodrigo Furman e Vinícius Rodrigues. Então, esse é o primeiro dia do nosso painel, o nosso primeiro painel. A gente vai receber vários estudantes que vão conversar sobre as suas pesquisas aqui. Então, on the next day, on Thursday, also at 3:30 p.m., we will have our second panel that will be with the Musmat group. So we are going to talk about our recent activities. So we are going to have, of course, Carlos Almada, Liduino Pitombeira, Daniel Moreira de Souza, Hugo Tremonte de Carvalho e Carlos Matias. Então, esse é o segundo painel do nosso congresso, vai ocorrer na quinta-feira, às 3:30 da tarde. Então, a gente vai receber o grupo Musmat, então todo mundo está aí na tela, a gente vai falar um pouco sobre as nossas atividades recentes. E, por fim, ok, Liduino, please, the next. Ok, on Friday, we'll have our last panel of our event, also at 3:30 p.m. We're going to talk about Schoenberg and Brazilian music and theory. We're going to receive Rodolfo Coelho de Souza from USP. He's going to talk about o rigor formal de Schoenberg e suas implicações na obra dodecafônica de Santoro Ernesto Hartmann. We're going to receive Paulo Costa Lima from the Federal University of Bahia. He's going to talk about Schoenberg e Widmer, possível diálogo. E também Carol Gubernikov, da Unirio. Esse painel será coordenado pela Ilza Nogueira. Então é isso, Liduino.
And for each day, at the end of the day, we have five concerts. one for each day. The first one is an homage to Arnold Schoenberg. It's works for piano. It includes works by Schoenberg and also original works written inspired by his works, sometimes using a series that Schoenberg used or other mathematical process. The second day, we have the wonderful Calimera Quartet that will play Schoenberg Ops 30, just the first movement, and also the call for scores with pieces written, inspired by Schoenberg's theory. The first concert today at 6 p.m., but tomorrow on it's going to be 7:30 p.m. The link will be available in the YouTube channel each day. The third day, we have works for bassoon by the bassoon player Ariane Petri, featuring three Musmat researchers, composers, Almada, Daniel Moreira, and me, Liduino Pitombeira, and also students, composers, and people from outside that sent a piece for this call for scores. On Thursday, we have a concert by the Inter-Brasilis Trio, flute, saxophone, and cello, with 4 pieces. And the last concert comes back the piano. It's the Homage to Schoenberg 3, featuring also Schoenberg's music and music that were selected by the call for scores. And now I sent back the word to Daniel that will, I'm sorry, to Professor Almada that will talk about Professor Frisch that will make the keynote. Thank you.
Thank you, Liduino. Yes, I am very pleased to introduce you our keynote speaker, Professor Walter Frisch. Professor Walter Frisch is professor at Columbia University in New York, where he has taught since 1982. He has also been a guest professor at the University of Freiburg in Germany, Yale University, Princeton University, and the University of Pennsylvania. He has lectured on music throughout the United States and in England, France, Spain, Germany, and China. His writings have been translated into French, German, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, and Chinese. Professor Frisch is a specialist in the musical composers from the Austro-German sphere in the 19th and 20th centuries, ranging from Schubert to Schoenberg. He has written numerous articles and 2 books on Brahms, including Brahms and the Principle of Developed Variation and Brahms, the 4 Symphonies. He served as editor of the volume Brahms and His Word, and was the founding president of the American Brahms Society. Professor Frisch's publications on Schoenberg include the book, The Early Works of Arnold Schoenberg, 1893 to 1908, and the edited volume, Schoenberg and His Word. He also edited and contributed to a volume on Schubert's music, Schubert, Critical and Analytical Studies. His book, German Modernism, Music and the Arts, investigates the relationships between music and cultural context in Austria and Germany during the period 1880-1915. Professor Frisch served as general editor of a series of period music histories from W.W. Norton, Western Music in Contest, is the title. His volume in the series, Music in 19th Century, was published in 2012. His book, Allen and Harburg's Over the Rainbow, appeared in 2017. He is now working on a book, Harold Arlen and His Songs, for Oxford University Press. Professor Frisch has twice won the Escape Deems Taylor Award for his writings. He has also been awarded fellowships from National Endowment for the Humanities, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany, and the Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. Please join me to welcome Professor Frisch. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Sorry. Can everybody hear me okay and see the screen now? I just began sharing my screen. It is a great honor to be asked to speak at this conference about Schoenberg in the 70th anniversary year of his death. And I'm very pleased to see on the program so many distinguished colleagues that I have known in some cases over many years, and as with my friend Carlos Almada, more recently. The richness and variety of the conference program attests that the study of Schoenberg's music is still very much alive and relevant in today's world to scholars, performers, and composers. Excuse me. As I look over the program, I notice too that much of the emphasis is on the later works of Arnold Schoenberg, especially his 12-tone music. This is not at all surprising, since the conference is being held under the auspices of the Musmat research group. And I think it's also inevitable at such a meeting that we hear specialized or technical papers about individual works. What I'd like to do here is take a broader perspective and speak about a 15-year span early in Schoenberg's career from 1897 to 1912. It was certainly one of the most productive periods for Schoenberg. On this slide, I've included 21 works, many of which are large or have multiple pieces or movements. We could also call this period formative, since Schoenberg was 23 and an autodidact at the beginning. Yet that is an inadequate term to describe these years, formative, because it is striking and perhaps unprecedented in Western music for a composer to move so rapidly and confidently through a range of musical styles, techniques, and genres, as shown on the slide. Without prior knowledge, one would hardly guess that the D major string quartet of 1897 and Pierrot Lunaire come from the pen of the same composer. Consider, for example, it's a kind of thought experiment, roughly comparable spans in the careers of other great composers. With Beethoven exactly a century earlier, the period from 1797 to 1812 would take us from his Opus 7 piano sonata to the 7th and 8th symphonies. With Wagner, 15 years spans Tannhäuser and Tristan and Isolde. With Debussy, it's the prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun in 1894 and the orchestral Hommage of 1909. Of course, each of these composers had a unique path, and yet in each case, I would argue that while the distance traveled is still great, the composer is recognizable in a way that it is harder to do with Schoenberg between the string quartet and Pierrot Lunaire. With Schoenberg in the 15 years between 1897 and 1912, we see a shift that seems more radical, fundamental, and difficult to characterize. In giving today's lecture a title, I chose the metaphor of a journey to avoid any specific implication of a distinct trajectory or development. Many descriptions of Schoenberg's career at this time favor the idea of a steady development. Schoenberg himself, writing near the end of his life, used the term evolution, implying a gradual change in compositional language and aesthetic. In a really excellent book about this period of Schoenberg's career by my colleague Ethan Heimo, who is with us today, Professor Heimo takes a similar view, describing a process of transformation which is in the title of his book, and of what he calls incremental innovation, unquote. In his own writings, Schoenberg also frequently frames his career in terms of musical historical determinism, saying that it was required by his position in music history to carry forward the development of German music as it had passed through Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms, and Wagner. It fell to him, said Schoenberg, to realize the logical consequences of their musical techniques. In 1909, Schoenberg tended to cast this process of change in more interior and psychological terms. He wrote of being driven by an inner compulsion. In a program note for the song cycle, The Book of the Hanging Gardens, he wrote, "I am being forced in this direction, not because my invention or technique is inadequate, but because I am obeying an inner compulsion, which is stronger than any upbringing. I am obeying the formative process," there again the word formative, "which being the one natural to me is stronger than my artistic education." And I'd like to thank Carlos Almada for providing me translations for some of the passages in the slides in my presentation. I'm very grateful. Now, this here is the language of expressionism shared by Kandinsky and other artists of the time. Indeed, Schoenberg can be considered one of the great musical expressionists of the early part of the 20th century, and also an expressionist in the visual art of his time, as we might hear in a presentation later in the conference, and as we see in a painting like the famous one called The Red Gaze. In my talk today, I'd like to retreat, at least tentatively, from this more developmental or compulsion view-based views of Schoenberg's career, and suggest these 15 years were filled with very unpredictable turns and dead ends. And yet, although I believe there's no straight line to be perceived through the works of this period, there are several features that we can identify and that I would just like to explore here. And I have them here in outline form. So first, a tendency toward formal experimentation while still employing the outlines of traditional structures, especially within some of the standard genres of instrumental music. Second, a tendency to expand the bounds of tonality while still, as with form, respecting many of the conventions of harmonic construction and progression. Thirdly, a tendency to mix or blend genres of music, absolute and program music, song cycle and cantata, or song and string quartet, for example. And then in texted works, works with texts, or instrumental works based on texts, Schoenberg seeks out a wide range of literary sources from very different literary or poetic traditions, mostly from the modern era, unlike, say, Mahler or some of his contemporaries who looked back towards Romanticism. And then finally, an exploration of the many different timbral possibilities with instruments and voices. So with these points in mind, I'd like to discuss briefly some of the key works of this 15-year period. So the early D major string quartet, he wrote in 1897 with the help of his only composition teacher and soon to be brother-in-law, Alexander Zemlinsky, who was only 3 years his senior, but a fully trained composer. And Schoenberg made one of his first large compositional efforts in the chamber genre that held the most prestige in the Austro-German sphere, the string quartet. And it was played at a concert of the Vienna Society of Composers in March 1898, the very group that Brahms had helped to found. So the first movement, I'm just going to play a little bit of it. Many of you might be familiar with it. Has a very attractive pentatonic melody of the kind that Dvorak used, especially in his American works. And at the same time, it has a kind of motivic and rhythmic intensity that Schoenberg admired and Brahms and that he would cultivate himself. Here's a bit of that. The third movement of the quartet shows Schoenberg striking out on a more individual path. It is in the form of a theme and variations, much beloved of many composers of this classic and romantic periods, including Brahms. But Schoenberg's theme is unusual, as you can see here, perhaps unique, in that the first four measures consist of a single melodic line played by the cello, which for the second four measures is joined by a viola playing in counterpoint. And he builds his theme from a series of short two-note units. So there's a very much an emphasis on linearity and motivic concentration. A very idiosyncratic kind of theme and variation. Now, the same year, 1897, that he wrote his string quartet, Schoenberg encountered the work of a German poet that would create a large shift in his career, one that I think could not have been predicted. This was Richard Demel, a leading poet of the time, whose strongly erotic and quasi-religious verse became popular and even notorious at the time, causing him to be brought into court on charges of blasphemy and immorality. Over the next 18 years, Schoenberg would sketch or draft or complete almost 20 works based in some way on Demel's poetry. The most intense phase of composition came in 1899, when he created 8 works. Now, in the year 1912, as you see here, he wrote to Demel, hoping that the poet would provide the text for a new oratorio that Schoenberg was planning, a work that eventually became Die Jakobslieder. Demel turned him down, but Schoenberg wrote to him, as you see here, "Your poems have had a decisive influence on my development as a composer. They were what first made me try to seek out a new tone in poetry. That is, I found it without even looking, simply by reflecting in music what your poems stirred up in me," unquote. One feature of Demel's poetry that Schoenberg and others admired was the strongly visual and musical dimensions in his verse. This is something Demel himself had noted in a diary entry of 1894. He says, "Nowadays, we aim to make poetic technique more sensuous by incorporating painterly and musical effects, just as painting and music attempt to learn new means of expression from the sister arts." This kind of artistic interchange or borrowing among the arts is reflected in 2 of Schoenberg's Demel works from 1899 that I want to discuss just briefly. First, a song, Erwartung, published as Opus 2, number 1. Lieder like this formed an essential part of Schoenberg's works in the very earliest days and really throughout his career. And again, in this, he aligns himself with a long-standing tradition of Lieder in Austro-German music. But at the same time, he's striking out on an individual path with his emphasis on the visual. In the poem, Erwartung, Demel achieves painterly effects. You can see a little excerpt at the bottom of your screen there in Portuguese, with careful descriptions of the scene, and the German is in the text. The sea green pond, the red villa, the dead or dark oak, and the white moon. And that's just in the first verse. And Schoenberg responds to these visual cues with a setting based on a color chord, or what I call a color chord, a dissonance that recurs in several different inversions throughout the song. I have to find, sorry. Here we go. Demel's poetry and Schoenberg's music can both be understood to relate to the artistic movement of Jugendstil or Art Nouveau in the years around 1900. This is an illustration from the French artist Edmond Dulac from a bit later, as late as 1917, but it is very much in the spirit of Art Nouveau. Indeed, it could almost be an illustration of the Demel poem, with the oak tree, the moon, the very mysterious figure, perhaps waiting for an assignation or a tryst, and then perhaps something representing water flowing there in green around the bottom of the illustration. An example of Art Nouveau of the time. Now, some of the same type of natural poetic imagery sets the scene for the Demel poem that Schoenberg would use in the same year as the source for his string sextet Verklärte Nacht. Here's the opening stanza. We have the night, we have the lovers, we have the moon, we have the dark oak tree, the black branches, quite similar in many respects to the scene setting in Erwartung. Now, Verklärte Nacht is very different, though. It's a string sextet, of course, for two violins, violas, and cellos. This is a page of the first the first page from the manuscript that's held at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. On the one hand, it's a piece of chamber music in the Viennese tradition, and on the other hand, it's a work of program music. This kind of clashing or combining of genres, fusion of genres maybe, that is so characteristic of the period of Schoenberg we're considering. And the musical language of Verklärte Nacht also has this kind of hybrid quality, as Schoenberg himself noted, combining elements of Brahms and Wagner. Schoenberg himself explained that the thematic construction is Brahmsian, with its emphasis on small motives and phrases of uneven lengths, and that the harmonic language, especially with chromaticism and the use of sequences, is Wagnerian, drawing often on the language of Tristan and Isolde. And the opening, I'll just play a bit of this, I'm sure it's familiar to many of you, synthesizes many of these elements. Actually, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second because I realized that you're not hearing good sound here. I didn't share sound from the computer all this time. I'm very sorry. I hope this will be better. I apologize. I'm going to stop that there. I apologize again I didn't realize that I forgot to share the computer sound. To move on here, I want to turn to another major work. In 1900, after completing Verklärte Nacht, Schoenberg decided to enter a competition for piano-accompanied song cycles sponsored by the same Vienna Society of Composers that had premiered his D major quartet. And the result was a song cycle that he missed the deadline for, but continued on with a cycle of songs and choral segments set to the poetry of the Danish poet Jens Peter Jacobsen, translated into German by Robert Franz Arnold. And this was certainly by far the most ambitious work of Schoenberg's to date, a unique blend, in this case, of song cycle, melodrama, and cantata that ends with this very well-known, glorious hymn to the sunrise. This is the final bit. cut that a bit short so that I can keep moving on. Schoenberg's next work is String Quartet. These are comments that he made about it in 1937, where he said that I combined all the achievements of my time, including my own, such as the construction of extremely large forms, greatly expanded melodies based on a richly moving harmony and new chord progressions, and a contrapuntal technique that solved problems offered by superimposed individual parts which moved freely in more remote regions of a tonality and met frequently in vagrant harmonies. This is the quartet from 1904 and 1905. And just very quickly, some of the features that are so special in this piece: the highly contrapuntal nature of the opening theme, one long continuous movement that nonetheless divides into a number of different designs, a four-movement design and a broader sonata form. And it also has a private program. So just to give you an idea of this, again, if you're not that familiar with it, the opening theme is really a combination of three different lines that are then inverted later on. And so it's the counterpoint that creates this dense texture with the three different parts going on at once. Here's just the opening. And the other passage I wanted to mention was in the transition for the sonata form, transition to the second theme. Here you have the music becomes virtually atonal in a way, because the entries of this fugal passage come not at the interval of a fourth or fifth, as would be standard, but at the interval of a minor third. So you see it's G, I circled them in red. You have G descending, G, E, C sharp, and B flat create this, this sonority. And I'm going to skip that example for now in the interest of moving on in time, and mention another special feature of this, a private program that was tucked into the back of Schoenberg's sketchbook, in German, of course. Here it is in English, that he never published. He never acknowledged. It was only discovered in 1986 by Christian Martin Schmidt. And it's a succession of emotional states, moods, that he seems to have written after writing the quartet. So it's an unusual, distinctive way of him describing the quartet, another different way. And let's turn quickly to the second string quartet, which Schoenberg completed in 1908. Once again, reimagining a genre, here by combining string quartet with the lead in the last two movements. These were set to poetry by Stefan George, who had now captured Schoenberg's imagination. And when the soprano enters in the fourth movement, as you see here, Entrückung, she sings of feeling the air from another planet. And this is also where we get the first clear triadic sonorities in a movement that is without key signature and has been largely atonal. As many have pointed out, this air of another planet seems to refer to this new atonal world into which Schoenberg is moving. And yet it is striking, at least, that in this passage, Schoenberg begins with the dissonant chord, this trichord on D, G, sharp A, and then moves to consonant triads on G major and F sharp major at the end. Just listen to that. With the Book of the Hanging Gardens, Schoenberg again returned to the poetry of George, and as he wrote in the program note, this was brought him in another direction, that he had said, as he said, I have for the first time succeeded in approaching an ideal of expression and form that has been in my mind for years. Until then, I lacked the strength and the confidence to make it a reality. But now that I have set out along this path, once and for all, I am conscious of having broken through every restriction of a bygone aesthetic. And if we look at the second song of the cycle here, the second one in the Book of the Hanging Gardens, we see that as in the first and second string quartets, traditional tonal gestures mingle with a more dissonance-based language. In measures 4 to 5, as shown by the first arrow, the vocal line rises in an unmistakable cadential move towards B. And when that melodic B arrives, it is supported by a B major triad, as shown by the second arrow. And the vocal part of the song, as shown by the arrow, the third arrow at the very end, concludes with yet another cadential gesture, the rising fourth DG. But these often appear in a context that does not support their tonal gestures. In the second of the little piano pieces, Opus 19, the tonal gestures stand out even more because of the sparseness of the texture. The little dyad G-B natural is the anchoring sonority of the piece. It hints at G major without ever confirming it. Indeed, the last chord, as shown in the second arrow, that persistent dyad is there, but it's essentially extinguished by a 4-note chord containing completely different pitches. This could be another metaphor, sort of as we heard in the second quartet, for the quenching or diminishing of clear tonality in Schoenberg's works. The year after completing the 6 piano pieces, Schoenberg turned back to texted music and to the poetry of the symbolist style, originating in France. First, he wrote Herzgewächse on a text by Maurice Maeterlinck, and then Pierrot Lunaire, using texts in French, originally in French, by the Belgian symbolist Albert Giraud, and then as translated into German by Otto Erich Hartleben. Now, this is a work as we know, a series of 21 melodramas, and it had its premiere in Berlin in October 1912. And here again, Schoenberg fuses different genres: chamber music, song cycle, and the melodrama, using spoken words with musical accompaniment. With Pierrot coming at the end of the journey I'm tracing from 1897, Schoenberg brings a new element into his musical aesthetic, that of irony. Traditionally, irony is defined as an incongruity between what is being said and what is meant or intended. That's a very simple definition. For Schoenberg, in 1912, irony becomes another way of approaching musical traditions, related to, but different from what we have just been exploring in the second quartet and the Book of the Hanging Gardens. Let me give just one example from Pierrot, and there are many more one could use. In the 19th number, entitled Serenade, Schoenberg indicates, as you can see, a very slow waltz. And the piano, or the instrumental introduction, contains many conventional gestures of a waltz, including the meter, the initial 4-bar phrase structure, and the basic contour of the piano part. And yet this is not a real waltz. To use a phrase from the literary theorist Gérard Genette, this is a waltz in the second degree. It's like a waltz once removed, or as Adorno would say, it is a waltz in quotation marks. The opening interval in the cello is a major third, B flat D, as you see in the circle in the outline. That's much sort of like the GB dyad that we looked at in the piano piece Opus 19. But here, that gesture is rendered from the start almost unrecognizable by the high register of the cello and by the span of a tenth. Some sense of the key of B flat is reinforced by the bass of the piano in measure 2. That's the circle, the other circle on the slide, where the B flat is approached as the tonic, quote unquote, from the dominant F. But here, as in the cello part of the preceding measure, the enormous span undermines any real cadential sense or tonal sense. To me, these kind of techniques in serenade comprise a kind of musical irony. That is, there is a disjunction or a distancing between the gestures and their actual musical content. For Schoenberg, this represents something basically new in his work, even though, as I have shown, he had used traditional gestures within non-traditional contexts earlier. Schoenberg himself emphasized that the tone of Pierrot Lunaire was to be taken as, quote, light, ironic, and satirical, unquote. Now, I do not understand as ironic the tonal gestures in Entrückung from the second quartet that we looked at earlier, or in Song 2 of the Book of the Hanging Gardens, the other piece we looked at. I don't understand them as ironic, even though they show Schoenberg achieving some distance from those tonal procedures and surrounding them with other kinds of gestures. With the second piece of Opus 19 that I looked at, we may be hearing something closer to irony, that insistence of the GB dyad, and then when it gets more or less smothered by the 4-note dissonance at the end. The ironic turn was taken by other modern artists in the Austro-German sphere in the years around 1900. And that includes Thomas Mann in literature, and in music, Mahler and Strauss, all around the same time. In Thomas Mann's fiction, including such stories as Tristan and Blood of the Veil Songs, he maintains an ironic stance toward the characters. The intention is, as Mann himself said, to elicit in the reader, quote, an intellectual smile, unquote. Something similar happens in music. For example, think of the elaborate fugato in the finale of Mahler's Fifth Symphony, or in many of the neoclassical gestures in Richard Strauss's opera Ariadne auf Naxos, or in Der Rosenkavalier. These often evoke an intellectual smile, as when you hear quotations from Mozart or Wagner, or indeed, in the case of Mahler, a kind of elaborate fugue or fugato. This ironic turn would continue in some of Schoenberg's 12-tone works coming in the decade after, such as the Serenade Opus 24, the Piano Suite Opus 25. It was one strategy of Schoenberg's to be able to reconcile and to recognize the gulf between the musical past and his own present. Let me conclude by showing you one of Schoenberg's self-portraits from the year before the composition of Pierrot Lunaire from 1910 or 1911. This is his self-portrait from behind. You can see that Schoenberg walks along a city street, his hands crossed behind his back, a walking stick or an umbrella in his hands. And we see him from above and behind. As he looks down or just ahead of him, we only see the street or the path that he's on. Now, this picture falls into a tradition of human figures depicted from the rear that the Germans called Rückenfigur. And it includes that tradition, this very famous image by Caspar David Friedrich, where we see the wanderer contemplating nature from the top of a mountain with the clouds and the trees. There we have the infinite vastness of nature. Now, Schoenberg cannot or will not survey his world from these kinds of heights. He only looks at the ground ahead of him. And in that sense, I would say Schoenberg represents himself as a genuinely modern artist, an artist who acknowledges that a creative journey is made one lonely and difficult step at a time, often without a clear vision of what may lie ahead. I believe that is what makes Schoenberg such an honest and compelling artist, one who could make the kind of musical and artistic journey that I have sketched out across 15 years, yet at the same time, never repeat himself or take anything for granted. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for your wonderful lecture, Professor Frisch. Now, I would like to know if someone has a question in this room.
I apologize again for the earlier audio quality issue. I hope it got a little better as it went on.
No problem at all. My camera, sorry. Oh, yeah. Oh, if I may, I would like to make a question.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you again. It's a beautiful lecture. I'm fascinated by this period, this initial period, Schoenberg initial period. And one of my favorite pieces is, as you know, the Chamber Symphony, Opus 9. And for me, in this work, Schoenberg implemented all the innovations he experimented in the previous works, especially in the string quartet, Opus 7, and merged all this innovation package with a tradition, a large amount of tradition. Is maybe is the main definition about Schoenberg creative personality, a perfect merging of innovation and tradition. How do you think about this work? Please, I would like very much to hear you about this symphony.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry to have left off or the Chamber Symphony. Yeah, you look at that list of works, and each one of them could be the basis of discussion. But certainly, that's a very important work. And as you say, well, first of all, it's again another one of these works that combines or fuses traditions, that of chamber music, that of symphonic music. They sort of collide in a way there. Reinhold Brinkmann had a wonderful article where he called it the compressed symphony, die gepresste Sinfonie, about the chamber symphony, and that it has so many features of the genre of the symphony, and yet at the same time, as we know, features of chamber music, the counterpoint, the kind of individuality of lines. So I think that work could be just as representative, maybe even more representative than the string quartet, certainly. And it's surprising when then he turns to the second string quartet, another piece of chamber music that does other things, combining with song cycle. It is almost hard to see the Opus 9 and Opus 10, again, in such close succession. But I think that certainly the Opus 9, represents a culmination of that phase. Maybe if we were to divide this period that I've just been talking about into two phases, or at least close to it, ending with the chamber symphony and coming to it through the first string quartet, and Pelléas and Melisande, another work I didn't mention, that also has all these formal innovations in terms of sonata form and four movement form, and the chamber symphony, as you say, and some of the same things that I mentioned in the quartet, and indeed in the other works, this a tonal framework, E major, essentially E major, the tonic being the chamber of the tonic of the chamber symphony, and yet so enriched. The role of the Neapolitan key, F major, comes in right away in the way the chords resolve, and the use of fourths. We saw several intervals of fourths in like the song from the Book of the Hanging Gardens and elsewhere as indicating maybe a kind of tonal aspect, but not. And then you have the stacking of the fourths right at the opening of the chamber symphony. So it's completely in that uses so many of those techniques or principles, including the formal experimentation of having four movement types and then a sonata form endeavor over it. And as people have often pointed out, it has some features of the music of Richard Strauss, the way the melody soars up at the beginning, very, very energetically, the wide span of a melody, even wider than you get in the first quartet. So yeah, I think that work is, now that we're talking about it, I think maybe that does mark the end of the first phase, 1906 or whenever, within the 15-year span in a way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Professor Carvalho.
Thank you. Hugo has a question, Professor Hugo.
Yeah, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much for the excellent lecture, Professor Walter. And I would like to ask you about the relation of the paintings works and the musical work of Schoenberg. More specifically, you presented some musical metaphors to poetry and so on along your talk. There is some similarities between Schoenberg's music and his own paintings, or some paintings that are illustrations of some of his music in some sense.
Yes, like the set designs for Die Glückliche Hand, maybe, or that were specifically connected to his music, his own. It's interesting. Maybe we'll hear more about that later in the conference, but he definitely, when he started painting in 1910, 1911, that period of concentration, he said it was an alternate means of expression for him, just as music was. At the same time, he admitted that he was an amateur in painting, and that, you know, sort of self-taught there as well. He said he had certain distinct skills. He could draw a complete circle, or you know, a perfect circle, or divide a line perfectly, maybe. So he had certain visual instincts or visual talents, but that as a painter, he was an amateur, and yet he viewed it as a alternate means of expression. I mean, I think he says in that famous interview about his paintings, he was never good at expressing himself in words, but when it came to music and visual images, you know, he felt more comfortable doing that. Yeah, the relationship, the actual relationship between his paintings or his visual works and his music, I don't know, that's a little harder to say, I think. I mean, on the most basic level, you see a mixture of representation and abstraction that, again, was common among other expressionists, you know, maybe such as Kandinsky. Kandinsky moving more directly towards non-objective painting in the, you know, 1909, 1910, 1911, and that Schoenberg's paintings have that, you know, elements that we recognize, like landscape elements or noses or hair or whatever, in a context that is often unfamiliar, rendered with expressionist colors or flattened forms or something like that. So I do think an analogy can be made there between, and that's why he wanted to paint and felt it was a valid thing. And then when Kandinsky wrote to him after hearing Schoenberg's music in January 1911 and said, "You are realizing in your music what I've sought for years to realize in my paintings, the sort of liberation of line from its obligation to represent things." I'm oversimplifying, but that's something when Kandinsky and Schoenberg discovered each other in 1911, it wasn't a question of influence, because they had both developed their styles already, but it was a kind of mutual recognition of striving towards similar things. And I think some of the same, and Kandinsky admired Schoenberg's paintings and displayed them in the Blue Rider exhibit very early on. And at least for Kandinsky, certainly what he heard in Schoenberg's music corresponded to what he would see in Schoenberg's paintings in many ways. I'm not sure that answers your question, but it's such a fascinating topic to pursue. And I know it's easy to be kind of superficial about it, or say, you know, if you're looking for a connection between a painting and a piece of music, you'll probably find it. But if you go to the next level down in aesthetics, or, you know, in the inherent nature of painting and music, you might find connections, or what Adorno called convergences of technique. I wrote about that a bit in my book on German modernism, how there's a notion of a convergence, which is not exactly a similarity, but it's each art finding in its own medium, its own technical possibilities, something that is going on in the other art without necessarily imitating it.
So I have a question from the audience.
Sorry.
Let's share.
Yeah.
From Professor Marcos Lucas of Unirio. Professor Frisch, thank you for your wonderful lecture. I'd like to ask you if you think Schoenberg's own paintings or expressionist paintings by his contemporaries informed his music in any way.
Well, I might sort of repeat what I've just said in a way, addressing that, similar to what I was saying. Again, I think it's the basic techniques or like some of the expression in paintings with an emphasis on color and shape rather say than linear form, or rather than form as such, that you can find that in his music. And again, I don't see a direct mapping of his own paintings onto his music. Other people might see that more obviously than I, but I do see this certain techniques of, and not to mention what we talked about, or I mentioned this inner compulsion. When Schoenberg and Kandinsky correspond, they also talk about this idea of an inner necessity of painting not based on your upbringing or your instruction, but on, expressing yourself. I mean, that's the sort of basis of expressionism, I think. And so that, I think that's definitely part of it too. It's not that any of these paintings are without form or structure. That's certainly not true of Kandinsky or Schoenberg or any of the members of the Munich school. But the idea that they're basing it on a kind of inner necessity that transcends conscious attempts to reflect things or depict things. Not sure that entirely answers the question, but that's what I'll say at this point.
I have another question from Eduardo Cabral. It is noted that the influence of short piece of Opus 19 is because Schoenberg had some influence of Weber. Can we have a dimension of how his students have influenced him in this period?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I can entirely answer that myself, but yeah, I mean, there is certainly this very atomized Weberian-like quality to Opus 19. I don't have the chronology completely worked out in my mind what Webern's music in this period would have been. But that makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to think what maybe some of my other colleagues can answer this better than I, such as Ethan. Which way the influences went in this period between Schoenberg and his pupils. Do you have anything to add in there, Ethan? You can unmute yourself and say something. You have to unmute yourself.
I unmute for just a second.
I appreciate that, yeah.
Yeah, my memory is no longer so good, so I might not get the things in the right place, but I was struck that Schoenberg's the Opus 19 pieces, including one that is very, very short. I mean, two of them, I think, are 11 measures. Is that correct?
Yeah, the fourth one is very short too, yeah.
And I've written elsewhere that I think that Schoenberg did this because of his encounter with his students' bagatelles for.
Okay, the bagatelle,
and,
yeah.
So I think, yes, I think Schoenberg was stunned to find that he had competition for being the most modern of moderns. And
then I see in the chat, Professor Menezes has added Berg's Opus 5 as well. So that's a really good point that if I incorporate that into my journey metaphor, that Schoenberg's journey was definitely influenced by his pupils, and maybe I should have made that more explicit or explicit at all, that something like Opus 19 or maybe even other things, that it's not just his solitary path of him looking ahead on the floor, on the ground, but that his pupils from 1904 on, that he becomes, yeah, inspired by and influenced by them, and that becomes part of his journey. I mean, he makes it his own for sure, in a way. We don't find anything quite like Pierrot, obviously, in the works of Berg or Webern, but that I think that's a really good point, that that we find that. At the same time, that the what I said is maybe the ironic tonal gesture, if we view it that way, of that G major that doesn't quite become G major and then gets, overtopped by that chord. That kind of, it's not humorous irony, but I do think it's the beginning of irony. That seems more characteristic just of Schoenberg, or of the direction where he came from and where he's going, which is different. He was older, obviously, than his pupils. And so that's sort of the weight of tradition as represented in a dyad. I'm probably over-reading it, but the weight of tradition is represented in that dyad as being overcome by a new atonal style. So he can show some of the influence of Weber and Berg, but he still does have his own journey to work through in moving ahead. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Well, unfortunately, we have to finish it now.
Yeah.
We're out of time. Thank you very much again, Professor Frisch.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor. Yeah.
Honor, it's our honor. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to have the first round table of the conference. It's called Compositional Process on Schoenberg Music. I will be chairing this table. So I am Daniel Moreira, if you don't know me. First, I will introduce the first presenter is Professor Carlos Almada from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He will talk about the principles of Grundgestalt and develop variation in a biomathematical model. I will read a little bit of his biography. So Carlos Almada is Associate Professor at the School of Music of Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. A scholar with research interests on music and theory and analysis, specifically focused on developed variation, computer-assisted analysis and composition, and structural studies in popular music. Composer and arranger, author of 5 books addressing the following subjects: Schoenberg's First Chamber Symphony in 2016, Counterpoint in Popular Music in 2013, Function Harmony in 2009, Structural Aspects of Brazilian Choro, 2006, Arranging in Popular Music in 2001. He's also leader of Musmat Research Group, member of the Brazilian Association of Music Theory and Analysis, member of the editorial board of Musmat, Brazilian Journal of Music and Mathematics. Please join me to welcome Professor Carlos Almada.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I will share my presentation. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, my talk is related to a research project that has been pursued since 2011. It corresponds to a systematic study of musical variation. In my presentation, I would like to focus on how Schoenberg principles of the development variation in Grundgestalt are incorporated to an original analytical model. This also involves some discussion about the strong connections that exist between musical and biological variation. Sorry. Let me introduce you the main elements of the theory adopted in research. It's called the model of derivative analysis, here in its most recent version. Firstly, let's see variation as an isolated phenomenon out of time. Consider this scheme as the base model for variation, in which a given referential music idea, P, the parent, is transformed by an action V, a generic function, into a related unit C, the child, in such a way that there is some amount of similarity between P and C. An alternative representation depicts variation as a combination of similarity and divergence. The model considers two types of variation: holistic, when the transformation affects the unit as a whole in some way, or the composable variation. In this case, there is a preliminary stage named abstraction, where in which musical components like pitches and rhythms are isolated and becoming referential for further derivation. The composable variation considers two types of domains, primary and secondary. In the model, pitch and time are considered primary domains, and harmony secondary. However, it's possible to add other parameters to this category, like dynamics, texture, etc. Domains contain attributes. This can be seen as structural descriptors of specific aspects of a domain. The pitch attributes are the pitch sequence represented with mid pitches, considering middle C as 60, pitch class sequence, intervallic sequence, melodic contour, an abstract representation of a melody considering just the relative positions of the pitches. The interval between the last and the first pitches. The temporal domain has the following attributes: the sequence of durations, the sequence of inter-onset intervals, the metric contour, analogous to the melodic contour, informing the relative metric weight of the events, and the durational span. Finally, the attributes of the harmonic domain, depicted in a hierarchical order: key, mode, chordal quality, there's a code, and root and bass. With this information, we can build a matrix of attributes with 12 rows and the number of columns corresponding to the number of events, in this case, 5. The first 4 rows are reserved for the pitch domain. The next 3 to the temporal domain, and the harmonic information occupies the last 5 rows, distributed according to the events. This 3-section structure is the default format of the matrix. Depending on the objective of the study, it can be shortened or enlarged by including a new domain. The research includes also the elaboration of algorithms for measurement of similarity between P and C. There are 2 possible situations. If P and C have the same cardinality, the simplest case, the edit distance algorithms calculate the divergence between corresponding attributes. This scheme is a general representation of the functioning of the algorithm, considering 2 corresponding cells of the 2 matrices. The second case, involving different cardinalities, is considerably more complex. It requires a transformational derivative analysis. The calculation of similarity between the 2 units involves the composition of the domains and analytical reductions. This example shows a especially complicated derivation. The highlighted layer, labeled as C' represents a sort of hypothetical intermediary stage between P and C, like a missing link between 2 live species. Since P and C' have the same cardinality, their similarity is calculated using the edit distance algorithms. On the other hand, the similarity between C and C' depends on the number of reductions and operations involved. a special formula combines the two calculations and returns the final similarity between P and C. Another important element of the model is the group of operations. Operations are applied to a parent attribute, producing a variant of it. Other operations can produce different variants of a same parent attribute. Operations can be basically of two modes: normal, when it affects all the components of the parent attribute, or mutational, when it affects just one component or a select portion of the parent attribute. Let us now see some examples. For simplicity, I am considering just pitch and time. In a specific operation, addition, that spans pitch and rhythmic intervals. Firstly, applied to attribute P3 intervallic sequence in normal and mutational mode, and now applied to T2 interonset interval sequence in normal and mutational mode. There are currently 26 operations formally defined in MDA. Let us now consider variation in function of time, or in other words, contextualized variation. This approach involves the principles of Grundgestalt and development variation, both elaborated by Arnold Schoenberg. Essentially, a Grundgestalt refers to a musical unity that, ideally at least, contains the basic material of a whole piece. In a very common metaphor, the Grundgestalt can be seen as a seed of a tree. This is a definition by Schoenberg himself, and this another one by Richard Taruskin. The second concept, development variation, refers essentially to the techniques that can be used for fulfill the implications present in the Grundgestalt. The principle is here defined by Professor Walter Frisch. And by Professor Ethan Heimer, both present here. It's an honor. Okay, let us now see how both principles are adapted in the analytical model, MDA. Firstly, the idea that the Grundgestalt can present segments containing musical structures that can be seen as potential agents for derivation. These elements are associated in the analysis with variables that they are used for labeling them in algebraic sense. For example, hypothetical example. Using the assumptions adopted in MDA, a basic model for development variation can be built in 4 stages. Firstly, the representation of ordinary variation with P0 being transformed into C0. Consider now C0 becoming apparent and having its own child by action of operation W. Observe that in this system, we can consider the relation between C1 and its grandmother P0. Let us name this an absolute development variation, dV, absolute dV, and the contiguous relations between P0 and C0 and P1 and C1 as relative dVs. The generic model for the event variation can be extended, forming large chains of transformation. This scheme models abstractly the organic growth of a musical piece by the application of developed variation techniques, process of techniques, to a basic unit, the Grundgestalt, at the center of the scheme. In MDA, there is a number of concepts and methodological strategies of, so to speak, bio-inspiration. Due to time limitation, I will briefly describe only these ones, the first three. Firstly, the genealogical notation is intended to precisely identify variants in development variation situations, which can be very complicated in some cases. Consider this referential unit A, and which give birth for example, 4 variants, A1, 2, 3, and 4. Take now one of these, say A1, and two variants from this, A1.1, A1.2, and so on. Therefore, dots are used for separating generations, and the numbers indicate order of arising. Consider now the reverse situation. We have a genealogical label and we would like to reconstruct its lineage. It's easily obtained like this. In addition, a genealogical label can be mapped to a unique code, especially useful information in a computer-assisted analysis. The order numbers become exponents of a product of a sequence of prime numbers. This is corresponding to an algorithm known as Gödel numbering, due to its creator, Austrian mathematician Kurt Gödel. The resulting integer is called the variance Gödel address, a code that ultimately represents its particular lineage. The next concept I would like to present is related to the notion of holistic or high-level DV, development variation. It's associated with the common idea of variation applied to concrete musical units, like motifs. Under our biological lens, we can compare it to a phonetic derivation, as considered in variation of populations. Here is an example extracted from our real derivative analysis, considering 2 related units, including measurement of similarity. The value of K indicates the amount of divergence between them. They are very close. In other words, the maximum similarity is equal 1. A complementary, that's a representation in another representation of the derivation. Sorry. A complementary concept is this decomposable DV or low-level DV, different variation. In this case, derivation of variables is on the focus. It can be compared with variation on the level of genus. Here, are some examples of low-level derivative analysis, considering pitch and time. Finally, phylogenetic trees in several formats are used in MDA in order to provide global views of the derivative process, considering both levels, low and high. This abstract graph is the complete tree concerning the numerous transformations of variable z related to intervallic sequence in analysis of Brahms' Piano Intermezzo, Opus 118, number 2. And here is the phylogenetic tree of the derivation of musical unities, the populations, in the semi-piece. As you can observe, there are several derivative paths, which reveals the multidimensional nature of variation in a piece. Observe the numbers on the arrows. They indicate similarity or divergence, better, between the nodes that represent the units. Sorry. From this, we can consider many possible lineages. For example, let us highlight maybe the longest lineage linking the Grundgestalt A0 to a remote descendant. Concluding, I introduced the main elements of a model of derivative analysis, for derivative analysis, focus on some special aspects that connect the idea of variation in musical and biological domains. This association, which involves not only metaphorical relations, but also concepts and original strategies, aims to systematize the analytical process. In this regard, Schoenberg's thoughts about variation, materialized mainly in the principles of Grundgestalt and developed variation, play a very central role. Thank you very much. This is a reference.
Thank you, Professor Carlos Almada. We will leave questions for the end of this section. So now I will introduce Professor Flo Menezes. He will going to talk about Schoenberg, the harmony and its color. I will introduce him. Flo Menezes defines his own music as maximalist since 1983. He is a composer of about 100 works in the most distinct genre and in the field of music theory and aesthetics, author of books such as Apotheosis of Schoenberg, published in 1987 and with a second edition in 2002. The Acoustic of Music in Words and Sounds from 2004 and 2014 by Atelier Editorial, Electroacoustic Music, History and Aesthetics, 1996, the first edition, and then another edition in 2009. Mathematics of Affection, a treatise of musical recomposition from 2013 by Duspi, Aesthetic Actuality of Electroacoustic Music in 1999, Maximalist Music in 2006, Risk About Music in 2018, and On Error in Composition in 2021 by Editora UNESP. Besides 3 books in Germany and Italy. He's full professor of electroacoustic composition at UNESP, where he founded and directs in São Paulo the studio Panorama, one of the world's leading studios in the area. Please join me to welcome Professor Flo Menezes.
Olá, boa tarde a todos. May I talk in Portuguese? Because
yes, of course.
I didn't find time to translate what I prepared in Portuguese, and I apologize, but I will make it in Portuguese. Tudo bem?
Tudo bem, sim.
Tranquilo?
Sim.
Eu vou dividir a tela aqui para a gente poder seguir. O meu propósito vai ser... Estão vendo aí, não? Espera aí. Ué, tá aqui. Share. Estão vendo? Não.
Sim.
Sim, perfeito.
Tá dando para ver, né? O que eu vou apresentar diz respeito a uma especulação em cima de aspectos da música de Schoenberg, tendo em vista uma conferência que eu realizei 10 anos atrás e que acabou sendo objeto de uma publicação já num livro chamado O Pensamento Alemão, organizado pelo Goethe-Institut na Cosaque Naive, né? Vou começar com a seguinte divagação, que diz respeito à seguinte pergunta: como classificar Schoenberg? Né? Indubitavelmente, a gente cai num primeiro paralelo, que é um paralelo entre a chamada Segunda Escola de Viena, dentro da qual Schoenberg se situa como grande pai, né? E Berg e Weber como os filhos mais próximos. Tiveram vários, mas ali acabou se formando esse triunvirato que a gente conhece. E a primeira escola de Viena, né? Haydn, Mozart, Schoenberg, Beethoven. E aí a gente pode fazer alguns paralelos interessantes, que seria qual o papel que ocupa cada um desses compositores. Sem dúvida, num primeiro paralelo, a gente tem Schoenberg como grande mestre, equivalente mais ou menos ao papel que Haydn teve como mestre, assim, como um compositor que praticamente assentou as bases paradigmáticas do que a gente depois chamou de classicismo, né? O Mozart como o discípulo natural, equivalente ao que seria Berg, né? E Beethoven como discípulo radical, que seria Weber, né? Eu estou usando aí nomenclaturas discípulo natural e discípulo radical que Pierre Boulez usa, se reportando à filiação, respectivamente, de Berg e de Weber em relação a Schoenberg, né? Com relação a Haydn e, ao mesmo tempo, a Schoenberg, nós temos de onde se seguem os preceitos, onde instalam-se as iniciativas, por quem edificam-se os estilos e se estabelecem os paradigmas, né? Daí o caráter de mestre de Haydn e, no seu paralelo, Schoenberg. Com relação a Mozart e Berg, uma confluência ideal entre a poiesis de uma época e o talento e o potencial de absorção, criação do criador, a que chamamos de talento, né? E com relação à radicalidade, antes é interessante observar com uma frase do Norbert Elias sobre Schoenberg, onde ele fala assim: é bem possível que a sensibilidade auditiva das diferentes pessoas difira de acordo com sua constituição natural, e que Mozart, leia-se aqui no meu paralelo Berg, tivesse de nascença uma sensibilidade rara. O que se pode provar, e portanto é mais fácil de entender, é a conexão entre a peculiar constelação humana que cercou a infância e a juventude de Mozart e o desenvolvimento de seu talento especial e de tudo mais que ele achava importante para sua realização. Aqui se reforçam mutuamente o desejo intenso de um pai, né, que é o Leopold, mas aqui leia-se Schoenberg, sujeito a frequentes sentimentos de culpa e a depressões, de alcançar sentido e realização na vida através do filho, e o intenso desejo de amor e afeto de uma criança emocionalmente inseguro. Leia-se aqui o Berg asmático. Tem uma frase muito curiosa de Adorno, que é uma das frases mais geniais para definir esse dilema psicológico até, que ele diz mais ou menos assim: aos sucessos de Berg, aos sucessos de Berg, Schoenberg, Berg desejava os insucessos de Schoenberg, mais ou menos assim. Quer dizer, esse espelhamento entre aquilo que aparentemente é fácil para o gosto popular e que Berg tinha essa acessibilidade, e ao mesmo tempo essa inacessibilidade da linguagem schoenbergiana, que faz de Schoenberg uma referência radical, né? A frase não é exatamente essa, eu não consegui lembrar exatamente, mas é uma frase genial que depois, se eu lembrar, eu vou citar. Com relação à radicalidade de Beethoven e Weber, um desejo de levar adiante por caminhos insólitos, absolutamente inovadores, a linguagem e sua sintaxe, revolucionando a partir dos paradigmas do mestre os próprios sintagmas e suas conexões. Se observarmos isso, por um lado, esse paralelo pode ser entrecruzado, né, onde aquilo que era antes visto como beethoveniano, né, vá para Haydn e Weber se estabeleça enquanto relação com Haydn, né, através de um esfacelamento do gesto formal e de uma fortíssima relevância dos silêncios, né, que caracteriza bastante a música de Haydn, uma certa assimetria, uma imponderabilidade do silêncio, né, várias pausas que acontecem de modo quase inesperado em sonatas, por exemplo, de Haydn, né. E o de Mozart e Berg a coisa meio que se mantém, mas se cruza a referência e se vai para o Schoenberg, que era o mestre, vai para a radicalidade onde estava Weber, através de uma organicidade extrema dos materiais, desenvolvimento radical da composição que atravessa a forma, né, o que é inaugurado, sobretudo com a sonata de 1853 de Liszt, né? Que é uma sonata onde você tem tudo, assim como o Mahler vai desejar constituir um mundo dentro da sinfonia, o Liszt já tinha feito isso com a sonata, né? A sonata tem absolutamente tudo, a começar de 3 temas, mas tem fuga, tem recitativo, tem valsa, tem tudo lá dentro, né? E inaugura num só fôlego o que a gente chama de Durchkomposition, que eu traduzo em português por transcomposição, né? Que é uma coisa bastante forte no século XX, né? Em vários criadores. Bom, se a gente observar a tipologia dos escritores ou artistas, segundo Ezra Pound, que eu acho bastante utilizável e bastante útil para entender a categoria dos artistas e seu peso em qualquer época, né? O Pound vai falar que existem basicamente 3 tipos, né, que são os inventores, os mestres e os diluidores. Pound enumera mais de 3, mas esses 3 acabam sobrando como os principais tipos, né? E eles foram bastante evocados, inclusive, pela poesia concreta paulista aqui no estudo dos irmãos Campos e do Décio Pinhatari, né? Por inventores, nós temos descobridores de um processo particular ou de mais de um processo, ou de um modo ou processo, né? Por mestres, o Pound define o termo se aplica com propriedade aos inventores que, além de suas invenções pessoais, são capazes de assimilar e de coordenar grande número de invenções anteriores, né? E os diluidores seriam aqueles que seguem os inventores ou grandes escritores, leia-se nesse contexto compositores, que produzem alguma coisa de menor intensidade, alguma variante mais flácida, de caráter difuso ou tímido. Como é que a gente poderia entender Schoenberg? Certamente, em princípio, cortando a denominação diluidores, e entender que Schoenberg foi, acima de tudo, uma mescla de inventores e mestres. Ele foi inventor e mestre. Por quê? Né? Por que inventor e mestre? Na invenção, você tem, por exemplo, 3 eixos fundamentais. Klangfarben Melodie, que foi radicalizada com Weber, mas foi inventada por Schoenberg, inclusive o termo, em 1909, na Harmonielehre, no Tratado de Harmonia. O Sprechgesang, que não foi uma invenção propriamente de Schoenberg, ele praticamente desenvolveu e radicalizou a proposta já existente em Humperdinck antes dele, mas sem dúvida Pierrot, Lunaire e de Glückliche Hand, outras obras, vai assentar isso como praticamente como uma invenção própria, né? E o dodecafonismo, que foi uma invenção schoenbergiana, né? Completamente uma sistematização completamente schoenbergiana. No entanto, existe um aspecto de diluição schoenbergiana que foi atacada em Schoenberg por toda a geração pós-weberniana, que diz respeito à utilização das formas clássicas, que, ademais, não é restrita a Schoenberg, né? Ao próprio Berg e Weber são assentados, né, sobre as formas clássicas de forma a quase não questionar a arquitetura dessas formas, né? Berg, sobretudo em Wozzeck, por exemplo, onde ele faz um verdadeiro compêndio de formas musicais ali, né? E Weber com uma invenção incrível, que é a simultaneidade de formas, né? Onde alguns movimentos em Weber podem ser ouvidos como diversas formas. Por exemplo, forma sonata, você vai lá e vê claramente que existe a forma sonata. Variações, você vê que existe tema e variações. Rondó, você vê que tem o rondó. Tudo isso num mesmo movimento, como, por exemplo, o primeiro movimento do quarteto Opus 28, por exemplo, né? Bom, mas mesmo quando considerado como um diluidor, entre aspas, Schoenberg lançou mão de suas invenções. Por exemplo, né, a partir de uma frase bastante importante de Schoenberg, quando ele fala, né, Die Entwicklung der Musik ist mehr als die der anderen Künste von der Entwicklung der Technik abhängig. O desenvolvimento da música é mais do que qualquer outra arte, dependente do desenvolvimento de sua técnica, né? E ele vai exemplificar isso muito bem com o que ele faz com a forma sonata e com a sua estrutura clássica, né? Onde você tem basicamente uma introdução, que é optativa, primeiro tema, transição, segundo tema, uma outra transição, desenvolvimento, recapitulação, coda e codeta, se a gente observar as principais segmentações da sonata clássica mais esmiuçadamente falando, né? E ele aliou a sua invenção, que é o dodecafonismo, ao recurso da forma sonata, para, disfuncionalizando a sua estrutura formal, desvinculando-a de suas funções tonais, né, que eram extremamente condicionantes da forma sonata, né, essencializá-la e torná-la de uma brevidade única, até então inaudita, porque desprendida do seu arco tonal, né? O que foi uma grande invenção, quer dizer, a partir da sua diluição, ele acaba inventando. Como? Notadamente no Klavierstück, Opus 33A, que é toda absolutamente uma forma sonata, né? Só que justamente por estar ausente o arco da tonalidade e estar assentada rigorosamente sobre o sistema serial dodecafônico, ele consegue comprimir essa forma sonata como ninguém outro conseguiu antes, né? Então vamos, por exemplo, tentar entender isso, espero que vocês ouçam aí, né, a introdução. Estão ouvindo? Ok. Primeiro tema. Transição. Dentro da transição, uma defasagem da introdução. Para chegar onde? No segundo tema, parte A do segundo tema, muito mais estático. Quase um episódio para a parte B do segundo tema. Uma transição. Desenvolvimento. Recapitulação, primeiro tema. Segundo tema agora. Parte B do segundo tema. Coda. Codeta. Mesmo quando um diluidor, Schoenberg foi mais ainda um mestre inventor. Ele foi capaz com isso de encapsular a sonata como ninguém pôde fazer antes, né? Bom, mas o principal para entender o estilo schoenbergiano é a sua dilaceração, a dilaceração do gesto em Schoenberg. Para ser mestre e inventor, Schoenberg teve de rasgar o gesto tonal e dilacerá-lo. A invenção do dodecafonismo permitiu a Schoenberg com que fizesse as pazes com o passado pelo viés do resgate das formas clássicas. Nesse sentido, tinha razão quando afirmava que não era um revolucionário, mas antes um evolucionário, né? E mesmo quando procedeu com as novas formulações do chamado atonalismo livre, termo, aliás, que ele combatia com veemência, né, não deixou de pensar um minuto sequer no sentido de cada dilaceração. Pois como grande músico tonal que era, um dos maiores da sua história, da história da tonalidade, basta ouvir o Gurrelida, que é uma das obras mais geniais da história da tonalidade, era como se estivesse dilacerando a si mesmo, né? O que não deixa de ser um conflito, né? Vamos tentar entender que daí decorre uma escritura analítica, em que por vezes tem-se ora dissociação temporal, ora dissociação espacial, interválica espacial, dos elementos expostos antes de forma coordenada, né? Vamos ouvir o início da primeira peça, Opus 11, de 1909, mesmo ano que ele escreve o Harmonie Lehre, apesar de ser publicado, eu tenho a primeira edição em 1911, em que ocorrem ambos os processos. Então vocês têm aqui o comecinho, né, do Opus 11, né? Etc. Tem uma figura muito interessante aí que ocupa 3 tempos e meio, né? Que é quando ele chega naquele mi sol, que em seguida ele vai exatamente repetir essa figura, mas de uma maneira analítica ele começa a distanciar temporalmente os elementos da figura. Então esse elemento que durava, essa figuração que durava 3 tempos e meio, passa a durar 4 tempos e meio, porque ele desloca a mão esquerda, né? E em seguida ele vai fazer 5 tempos e meio, observando a semínima como um tempo, né? E vai diluir ainda mais isso. Mas quando isso se dilui ainda mais, o que acontece? Brota um elemento no meio que não existia antes, né? Aquele ré bemol dó, que é um elemento novo, produto da dilaceração mais radical do tempo, né? Isso demonstra que em Schoenberg o gesto é estirado, e no estiramento do gesto, que é de fundo de índole analítica, né, ele faz deflorar ideias novas. Então brotam ideias de dentro da ideia dilacerada no tempo, né? O que é uma coisa bastante oposta à poética, por exemplo, impressionista de Debussy, onde as notas se juntam com um efeito de distância, onde você percebe as notas de distanciamento. Existe muito mais uma tendência estatística de percepção do conjunto, das ondulações, né, do que de dissecar o elemento de dilaceração de gesto. Então existe uma coisa que opõe completamente a poética de Schoenberg à poética de Debussy, né? Fora isso, você tem, no final desse trecho, uma espacialização interválica radical, né, apesar de uma compressão temporal, né? Assim como ele dilatou aquele elemento todo inicial e estirou no tempo, aqui ele comprime uma figura cromática de si bemol, lá, sol sustenido, sol, fá sustenido, né? Só que no registro todo do piano. Fora uma especulação bastante interessante que acontece ali com aquele acorde, que nada mais é do que uma reordenação dos intervalos do acorde de Tristão, que é uma entidade altamente paradigmática e que não está em Wagner, né? Está em Machot, está em Scarlatti, está em Mozart aos montes, está em Beethoven, está em Brahms, está em muitos outros. Foi dado de canja para Wagner com o começo da sonata de 1853 de Liszt, né? Quando ele vai ti, to, di, ta, to, né? Sol, si bemol, si ré, dó sustenido, si bemol, sol, mi. Você tem si bemol, o mi, si bemol, ré, sol, que é um tristão, né? no perfil do Liszt, né? E foi feito antes do Tristan e Isolde. E, no entanto, você tem lá no Wagner essa estigmatização toda do acorde do Tristão, por ele não resolver e por existirem tantos na introdução do Tristão e Isolde, e você tem lá trítono, terça maior e quarta. O que você tem aqui? Terça maior, trítono e quarta. Você tem uma permutação na ordem, na sobreposição intervalar da mesma entidade, mas o Schoenberg está pensando claramente em Wagner aqui, né? Eu toquei e acabei... Uma pena. Deixa eu tentar voltar, porque é interessante ouvir isso com a partitura. Isso que eu acabei de explicar. Então você tem lá a primeira figura com 3 tempos e meio, a segunda com 4 tempos e meio, a mesma figura com 5 tempos e meio emergindo o elemento novo, você tem essa oscilação completa do elemento cromático no final, e você tem o acorde de Tristão reinventado, digamos assim, a partir da permutação dos seus intervalos. Vamos ouvir. Essa figura. Disseca e desloca a mão esquerda, introduz Ré bemol, Dó, que não existia antes. Ele analisa a figura, né? Agora o Tristão reinventado aqui. E no final, agora, as figuras cromáticas espacializadas, né? Então você tem aí, em poucos compassos, um arsenal inventivo impressionante. Tal dissociação parece encontrar paralelo nos constantes contrastes acentuados de dinâmica, em que figuras em pianicíssimo são interceptadas por outras em fortíssimo. Por exemplo, a giga, né, peça final da suíte, Opus 25. Ouçam a contraste dinâmico. Olha isso, em relação ao que estava. Percebam como o contraste dinâmico vai ficando cada vez mais agrupado, menor. Olha isso. A interpretação é, na minha opinião, o melhor intérprete de Schoenberg, Pollini. Olha isso. Os contrastes vão ficando cada vez mais aproximados. É um exemplo de como isso também se reflete do ponto de vista da dinâmica, essa dilaceração do gesto. Na essência desse estiramento, em que...
Com licença, desculpa, é porque o tempo está acabando, você consegue concluir em 5 minutos?
Eu estou concluindo, tá bem
Tá
rápido.
ótimo, tá bom,
Tá.
desculpa.
Tenho 5 minutinhos?
Sim, mas 5 minutos para fechar é suficiente.
Tá legal. Então, na essência desse estiramento, em que extremidades são espacializadas, estiradas, distanciadas por um gesto que se instala como uma lupa da expressão, a gente tem o que a gente chama de expressionismo, né? Propriamente dito, que é o que difere a música de Schoenberg do impressionismo de Debussy, né? Se a gente retomar a aproximação que fizemos entre Schoenberg e Weber, aí a gente tem uma paráfrase de Adorno ao referir-se a Beethoven, que ele fala que se autodenominava proprietário de um cérebro, a contrapelo dos proprietários de bens, né? Isso está num texto do Adorno, Introdução à Sociologia da Música, Hirnbesitzer, né? Que o Willy Correia de Oliveira utiliza, inclusive, como seu título no livro Beethoven, Proprietário de um Cérebro. Mas, na realidade, a gente vê que o gesto esfacelado expressionista de Schoenberg decorre de uma escritura analítica, né? E que, consequentemente, ele não fez simplesmente o gesto, ele nem meramente reproduz o gesto, ele pensa o gesto, né? Ele analisa o gesto que ele faz. E daí vem uma sistematização, né, que acaba fazendo de Schoenberg um compositor altamente racionalista, racional, né, sem abdicar de um alto conteúdo de expressão que decorre desse rasgo do gesto, né. Bom, eu acho que eu concluiria aqui, porque eu acho que depois eu ia falar da questão dodecafônica, né, propriamente dita, de que isso é uma ilusão, de achar que isso ia conseguir fazer com que houvesse uma hegemonia do pensamento alemão, né, porque o pensamento não é propriedade, se o Beethoven era o proprietário de um cérebro e Schoenberg também, o pensamento não é propriedade da Alemanha, todos nós pensamos, né, e muito, né, sobre a questão da música. E eu ia acabar com a suíte, porque a suíte, o minueto da suíte, ele apresenta uma coisa muito interessante, que é um ápice da ideia inicial, onde o motivo Bar, Mi bemol, Ré, Fá, Mi, acaba culminando no último tempo em Sol bemol, Dó, Mi, mais o Si, que é resolvido pelo Lá na voz superior, que dá o acorde de Tristão. Então ele junta com absoluta intenção Bach e Wagner no meio do sistema dodecafônico, na inauguração do sistema dodecafônico, que faria com que houvesse a tal hegemonia da música alemã, né? Mas que é um detalhe que menos importa, o que mais importa aqui é entender o dilaceração do gesto, esse estiramento expressivo e o legado absolutamente genial de não só se fazer a escritura, mas se pensar os elementos da escritura, né? Então, basicamente é isso. Eu encerraria aqui para não ficar muito longo, porque a gente ouviu como último trecho esse trecho, mas acho que não há necessidade. Acho que eu posso encerrar aqui. Obrigado.
Bem, muito obrigado, professor Menezes. Foi uma excelente apresentação. Apenas não temos tempo para termos o resto da apresentação, mas teremos outras oportunidades em breve. Bom, now we're going to start in English again, because I will introduce Professor Achille Picchi from the UNESP. He's going to talk Nacht, number 8 from Pierrot Lunaire by Arnold Schoenberg, a perspective from the Artsong theory on the text-music relationship and its unfoldings. Professor Achille Picchi has a doctorate from Unicamp, a master's degree in education from the University of São Paulo in 1996, a bachelor degree in piano from the Centro Universitário das Faculdades Metropolitanas Unidas in 1973. He is also a bachelor degree in art, in Portuguese English, from the Santa Maranhense Organization of Education and Culture in 1973. Graduation in Artistic Education at the Centro Universitário das Faculdades Metropolitanas Unidas, also in 1973. He's also currently an assistant professor at the Institute of Art at São Paulo State University. He has extensive professional experience as a university professor in the areas of composition, music history, music theory, and analysis. He's also a national and international career as a pianist, a regent, a songwriter, and a musicologist. Please join me to welcome Professor Achille Picchi.
Okay. I would like to thank you, everyone, Daniel Moreira, and especially Mr. Pitombeira, my dear friend, for the invitation to this important event. And I would like to share my screen for a moment. Yeah. Share here. Okay. Is everyone seeing this? It's okay? Okay. Yeah. Well, sorry. Well, when I was invited to this important event, I kept asking myself what I possibly could say about Schoenberg in general to a specialized circle of musicians here present. Even on Pierrot Lunaire in particular, since it was subject of such a huge literature, either historical, critical, analytical, or interpretative. Therefore, my choice led on an informed opinion and a personal consideration about Pierrot's relationship on text music linked to intentionality and ultimately the role of number. Concerning text music, I have chose Nacht, the 8th melodrama and first song of the second part, around which I've made observations relative to my theory of Artsong published in my latest book, toward understanding of it. First, though, I will make a brief digression over my point of view on text music and intentionality. In establishing an Artsong theory, I believe that the idea of text music is a ground-striking one in the knowledge of what vocal music would be in its own sake, as vocality plus integrality, considering all means on which its developing is going on. For me, this is an invisible whole in the creative treatment. I call musication, musicação in Portuguese, the act of setting music to a text, be it poetic or not, with the straightforward intention that will be sung, or similarly expressed differently from a normal speech. This means that any reading that a composer makes of poetic text, which he intends to musicate, musicar, it is not a common one, a regular reading, understanding and comprehension, because it's really fulfilled of musical preoccupations, aka intentions, that are intrinsically linked to his technical repertoire, life and cultural experience, talent as well as perception of details, care for his creative processes, like word soundings, repetition ideas, form and shape of the text, etc. In summary, verbal, iconic, and imagetic stimulations are, in other words, representation and symbolization. It is well known that Schoenberg doesn't know about Albert Giraud, the Belgian symbolist poet, and his poems, which include Pierrot Lunaire, till the singer-actress of the Überblättel Theater commissioned him to set to the poems in order to make a recital tour. Schoenberg accepts the task with enthusiasm and interest, selects 21 poems to make a cycle. The translation to German, or transduction, as maybe we'll say Haroldo de Campos, is the only poetic text to be considered as a basis for the musication that Schoenberg undertakes, even if he eventually have been in contact with the French originals. This is, finally, very important, because I believe that exists, as already mentioned, two great paths for musication, including inside the reading, or maybe perusal of it, the composer makes. One is representation, the other, symbolization. Both in those musically, the imagination, the techniques of the creator that he transports to sounds, including those beyond the voice. It is curious to observe how vocal music along the 20th century was an impulse for the musical avant-garde. And it's possible to say that the melodramas of Schoenberg's Opus 21, the Pierrot Lunaire, was an initial milestone to push the same avant-garde on. Besides, somehow it was a boost in the camera vocal music with instruments, differently of the Romanticism, which is Artsong with piano. The Pierrot Lunaire effectively represents a fracture in the history of Western music history. Compositions with text, in reality, constitute the major part of Schoenberg's output, including his tonal periods or atonal periods, including the decaphonic one. Schoenberg, as known, always underlined the role of music as messenger carry-on over vocal musical works, but he knows, though, the importance of the text in the integrality of the vocal work, for, as himself said, songs, and I quote, songs, opera, and oratorios don't simply would exist in music if wouldn't be additioned to them the more high expression of their texts. Besides, how to be sure that your music doesn't express anything, or even more, doesn't express something provoked by your text? End of quoting. The text is a factor that, despite being external, is a fundamental one in the conceptual stage of composition. It influences, undoubtedly, form, character, and other creative ways. Near the music, the text has engendered a more vast totality, whose meaning is, by this way, another. Those influences and definitions manifest themselves definitely in the intentionality. Intention and intentionality. To comprehend intention and intentionality in vocal works of music imports to consider three basic questions. 1, it's always possible to know the composer's intention. 2, the intentionality is expressed on the musical text. And 3, there's always the possible mediation of the musical intentionality as a renewed intention. The intention is an action of the will. Someone that does something intentionally is aware of one's action and do it, using the choice to do it. It acts by volition. Departing from the fact that choices exist and must or want to be completed, there's an intentional relation of them, and this relation implies a will content. That is, the volition has always a content, and acting intentionally means satisfy this volitive content. In the case of music, especially the vocal works, this realization of the conditions of intentional satisfaction that relates volition and action is the primeval stimulation to the composing work, which is the writing, l'écrit en français. The composer that always have a specific compositional intention around a volitive choice directs himself to a conscientious writing down of this intention as a mean of definition. Doing so, he leaves a track, a pathway of his intentional mental state, transforming all those things in an intentionality, the score. Thus, the intentionality is the expression of the last intentional compositional choice worked out as a text, where resides a field of significations. The score overlooked to two stances. the written, l'écrit, a selection of a code and all its implications and relations, and the écriture, l'écriture, which means roughly what lay behind the code, or syntactic and grammar processes, and beyond them, those things that reside between the code and the sound, the music. The choices made in musication undertaken by the composer to musicate a poetic text lead him to intentional choice actions directed to the selected intentionality through technical expressive workout of the musical text, becoming, through l'écriture, musical ontology. This is why, by means of intentionality, the score becomes a map, providing a great number of interpretations, which will be made always a posteriori, and with attribution of meaning. This attribution is due especially to analysis. There isn't, therefore, mediation without text, and departing from it will be the principal task of interpretation, provided that an interpretative execution leads to a full performance if it is the objective. In intentionality proposed by the composer in Pierrot, it also appears a specific vocality. The consecution of sound in speech transforms itself in vocal sign and symbol. The voice is emission, intonation, volume, extension, dynamics. When organized, it originates the discourse. Roland Barthes located a materiality in the voice due to its relationship with the discourse. Even though it's not possible to identify a physicality of the voice, undoubtedly its existence is due to an abstraction conducted by a sounding vehicle functioning as expressivity. The singing voice related to the vocal work of music hosts a specific vocality. It has the attributes of existence of the voice, emission, intonation, timbre, etc. It represents decisively chosen processes. The vocality encompasses everything the voice is able to realize, to show, to express, including itself. And this concept goes beyond qualities like timbre and practice and considers everything that is being vocalized, sounded, and identified as vocal by editory means by far the words, discourse that illustrates it and generates the text, or even beyond its techniques or its colors. Schoenberg notoriously opted by the Sprechgesang vocality in the Pierrot. It doesn't represent exactly a novelty, since from the 1890s was already a vocal resource used by composer, especially the same Schoenberg used it in previous compositions. Excuse me. Beyond the fact that novelty or the new do not exist as being there, Dasein metaphysics, only whereas originality along the unfolding of time crystallizes a past that represents the new, the Opus 21 represents a fracture in Western music, as I've already said and put it, in terms of the systemic and continued use of the Sprechgesang, the placing of a synthesis theatrical vocal in the sense of orality cantability sets the pure expression, and like it, the original in unique states. Sprechgesang, truthfully, wasn't a term employed by Schoenberg in the Pierrot Lunaire, just Sprechstimme, speech and voice, roughly. He employed other terms too, less often, like gesungen, sang, gesprochen, speaking, and geflüstert, whispered. Sprechgesang could be translated as a manner of singing, a kind of parlando sometimes, even translated as recitativo. An important composer and musical thinker, as Flo Menezes, here present, says that there is a proximity between the recitativo and the Sprechgesang, and goes further to the fact that perhaps it is due to a typically expressionist interpretation full of gestuality. As we have seen above, in fact, is possible to the German language translate or even understand Sprechgesang as recitativo, but I think not really as Rezitation as written by Schoenberg, which differentiates things even more. All this allows me to disagree a little bit from that important composer thinker in the interpretative sense. As known, in the preface of the Opus 21, Schoenberg established some instructions how to perform the Sprechstimme. Nonetheless, they are not exactly clear or even precise, provoking many problems even after. Let us just not forget the fondness Schoenberg had to the paradox, beginning with the statement, Pierrot, Lunaire ist nicht zu singen. Flo also says that the bottom line of the problem may be, obviously, in the relationship between the speaking and the singing, and that's what I agree with. But he goes on saying that what exists, really, is an exaggerated intonation beyond the limits of speaking and before the limits of singing, and that I don't think so. A detailed analysis can and will demonstrate the quantum Schoenberg tried a specular amplification of real vocality, inventive in the symbiotic sense, which keep all the characteristic superlatives of the speech and intonative of singing in a unique totality for this masterpiece. The text music categorizations and of the vocality are kept under a new drapery, maybe confirming his idea of Schoenberg's, an heir and follower of a great German music tradition, classic and romantic. In the latter case, with the voice as representative together with the language of a cultural identity that he thought fundamental. On being like this, he was an inevitable historical force. Textual analysis. In order to provide some exemplifications to my ideas of text music and intentionality, I chose Nacht, the 8th song of the cycle, the first one of the second part of Pierrot Lunaire. This analysis that belonged to my Artsong theory is divided in 4 parts called structures: rhythmic structure, metric structure, strophic structure, and sonic structures, and refers to the poem in the first stanza. After that, I realize a connection with the music through the text music embedded with the previous textual analysis. Rhythmic structure. The rhythmic structure studies the ictus, tonic attenuations, the proper ones, and the dislocated. There is a relation between ictus and tonic accentuation, indicating the stressing of verses regarding the verse as a whole, as you can see in this table. Nacht is a heptasyllabic ictorhythmic poem, which means that regarding accentuation, there is a tendency to the 7th syllable always. Nonetheless, we can observe the 1st, 3rd, and 7th syllables as more frequent in the poem and the 5th less frequent, as well as the musician goes primarily to the 3rd, 5th, and 7th syllables in agogics. Metric structure studies the versal scansion and the situation of the metric feet. A metrical foot is constituted by a number of syllables and letters that contains. To be effective, the counting of metrical feet is based on tonicity of the syllables. It is the major accentual one relatively to the minor one. The scansion takes into account the sonorous fluidity and its importance to the rhythm of the verse, as well as the rhythm combination in musiciation. This is the table. As you can see in table 2, the predominance of terqui, strong weak, and pion quartas, weak, 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 strong, gave us an idea of use the composer in Pierrot. The first figure, used unconsciously and regularly, shows us a rhythm very ordinary and common in the configuration of the Carnavale di Venezia figures, especially Pierrot, Arlecchino, and Pantalone. We can see this, for instance, in the beginning of Gebet am Pierrot, the trochee as an exclamation, Pierrot? But not the second one, though. Surprisingly, the anapest, weak, weak, strong, is the more agogic used by the composer, as for example, contrary to the dactyl of Soneglanz of the poem. The voice sings Verschwiegen with the moth motive in the low region. In the poem, we have two trochees in the metric, but due to significant gesture of secret or discreet or silent, the composer made it with three accents, strong, 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 equivalent in poetry to a figure named molossus, which is used in case of extreme emotional term, fortissimo or pianissimo, as in this case, revealing the theatrical sense of the text music here. Strophic texture studies the grouping of the verses that forms a unity in the conception of the poet, or sometimes the traditional poetic forms. This grouping is called stanza. Depending on the poem, there are isostrophic poems when the grouping of stanzas is a regular one, or allostrophic poems when it is irregular. It is important to understand the influence in the form of thought of the composition. Here is the table. We can observe that since the poem has three stanzas, so Schoenberg organized his format in three parts, including an attention stop on the Verschwiegen, where is the motive in thirds, or the moth motive at the measure 10. He introduces the second section with a modification on tempo, etwas rascher, and the third with a near modification of tempo, tempo primo, as a return to previous spirits. Before the third part, a tremolo fortissimo in the piano makes the same attentive stop, but no with the recitation of the text with an ironic and stentoric mood, finstere, schwarze Riesenfalter. The clearance of movement by augmentation of figure values, thus provoking a written ritenuto, takes place as a remembrance of the beginning, exerting the role of a coda and completes, in so doing, the symmetry or the discourse perceived by the listener. Well, sonic structure studies the sounding coincidences, internal and external, of all kinds, especially rhymes. It is a complementary point for textual analysis, where you can see if sound patterns and its respective coincidences emulate the sonic imagination of the composer, even if he intends to use them in an obvious way. In Nacht, Schoenberg didn't have any preoccupation, composition or other, with it, but along the Pierrot, he uses a lot of it. Considerations. Few artists of our time are so stimulant to the spirit as much as Schoenberg is, and his music witnesses this statement clearly. He felt in himself, like sometimes he declared, the weight of history of music, in the sense of some straightforward continuation of the great Austro-Germanic tradition. And this means specifically on the grounds of his direction to a near future, with the ideas that he considered how to understand music as a life fact, with logic, coherence, and comprehensiveness. In other words, the structural comprehension of major works. He aimed basically, and with insistence, to modify the way people listen and understand music by making them understand its architecture. Really an illuministic ideal, yes, if you want, but not an unrealistic one, and presented in all his output and manufacture, as well as his aesthetically, magnificently. His obsessive use of techniques that, according to him, could be listened to in order to create interest in the world of art is totally transparent in Pierrot. For example, in the cutout that I've made, Nacht, we can observe this obsession in action by means of the exhausted use of transformations of the principal motive, variations, extensiveness, fragmentations, figurations, intricate melodic and harmonic contrapuntal techniques, especially with the secondary motive, like any other traditional oeuvre, all in all to ask us for commitment, to compromise, to involve with his effort to deliver a work of art, and assure us how the great tradition as well as the great dilemma exerted on him its real historic weight. Here I present a show of motive working out. As you can see, there is a great variety of use of the motive, the considered moth motive there. Schoenberg has, as a genius composer and original thinker, cared about beauty himself as much as any classic philosopher, musician in history before him did. The great aesthetician and philosopher of art, Luc Ferry, in his book Homo Staticus, says that Pierrot pretended to be a breakthrough in the idea of beauty, understand it as harmonic synthesis of a multitude of songs. I couldn't disagree more. Looking to and analyzing Pierrot, I could devise the principles of symmetry, adjustment and complex organization, number, internal harmony, use of all the possibilities of polyphonic counterpoint. The whole of this Offentaube book allowed me to think that Pierrot is really a resignification of beauty itself, as a renewal of rearrangements of the same secular sounds in absolute new possibilities. The choice of new vocal techniques in a systematic way, as he did from Pierrot on, was a clear departure point for extended techniques, not only in voice, but instrumental too. And also, Pierrot as a whole represents a new attitude towards the beauty in the sound, in the sense of a relocation of equilibrium and organized chaos. As a Jew, Schoenberg had all his life a great commitment with religion, alternating periods of crisis and calm, but especially with the mystic of it. And one of the facts of that is the liaison with the number, symbolic and literal. Here I want to close my speech delivering some curiosities on the matter. All his life, Schoenberg was fascinated by the numerology and believed that the complex calculations over the numbers and letter provided interpretations that were a powerful source of knowledge. This was linked with the Gematria, a branch of the Jewish Kabbalah. He was so convinced that once he complained to a friend who blamed him for his beliefs, saying that he was not a Kinderspiel, scherzo infantile, but something very serious indeed. In the Jewish tradition, the 3 and the 7 plays an important role in the Kabbalah. Their signification goes, for 3, the unification of contraries and harmony. The 7, mysticism, introjection. The sum of them means the great number, the 10, elevation and wise. And Schoenberg paid a great respect for all this. So in the Pierrot, we can see it. Schoenberg entitled the Pierrot Lunaire as 3 times 7 poems as his choice for the cycle. The idea of 21 poems suggests the inverse of 12, another important number in Jewish tradition, which occurs in all written texts, but number of opus 2, an exact counter-image of year of composition, 1912. Coincidence? Well, the numbers 3 and 7 and their correlatives dominates Nacht in the Pierrot. Beginning with the moth motive, composed of thirds, one minor, another major. His first appearance in an ascendant form suggests the triangle, and all transformations alike. This triangle also suggests, as some analysts have said, the form of the moth. The variations in general are multiples of 3 as figuration and disposition. The secondary motive, a chromatic scale, is a line of 6 notes, or 3 plus 3. The poems chosen are all written in a rondeau form, have 3 stanzas each with 4 verses, and the 21 of them added result 84, which is 12 summed up given 3. The ensemble is composed of voice, 5 instruments, and a conductor, total 7. What allows us to say that is the reason because the composer chose the alternative instruments for the same instrumentalist. Formally, Nacht is composed like 3 measures of introduction, 7 measures of section 1, 6 measures 3 plus 3, section 2, 7 measures section 3, 3 measures coda. And I observed 3 measures introduction, 3 measures coda, symmetry, number symmetry. Schoenberg abhorred the 13, maybe because he was born in September 13th, 1874. A Freudian case, perhaps? And fate did not cease in his tricky way to cross paths with our composer. He died in July 13th, 1951. And even more 13th, he passed away precisely at 23:47 hours of Friday 13th, or 30 minutes to midnight. To finish with, if you sum up all letters transformed in numbers by the traditional numerology of the entire name, Arnold Franz Walter Schoenberg, you will obtain 31, which is the inverse of 13. Thank you for your patience to listen to this communication.
Well, thank you, Professor Achille Picchi. It was a stunning presentation. So now we're going to have some questions for the audience. But before, I would like to ask you, if you, Professor Carlos Almada, Professor Menezes, and you, Professor Achille Picchi, if you have any questions for each other for starting a debate. So before the audience, if you have some questions, you can do. Oh, I noticed that Professor Menezes have a question on YouTube. If you want to question it right now.
Yes. I asked to Achille, my good friend that I don't see since 2 years because of the pandemic, and I'm seeing now with great pleasure. The Sprechgesang was a borderline between spoken language and song. Why do you not agree with this assertion, or you agree and I didn't understand well?
No, yeah, I didn't. It's not that I don't agree. I don't agree the fact that Sprechgesang may be the passage to formal language and formal speech to formal voice, singing voice. To me, is you say very well the border, but the border tends to what? This is the thing. In my idea, Schoenberg didn't know exactly what he wanted with it. He wanted more a symbol of the idea of the Sprechstimme, which is theatrical in all verses, more than the single singing voice with influence of inflections of the voice. This is my idea. So Sprechgesang for me is like a tendency to make a distortion of Gesang, the German tradition of the Gesang, which I study so much. And I don't think so. I think this is a new it's invention, as you said very well before. It's a new way to think the expression of the voice, but not singing it. And in this case, also not speeching it.
But on the other hand, Achille, it's very important to have in mind that Sprechgesang is strongly related with cabaret.
Yeah, I know.
A kind of utilization of the cabaret language in the atonal context. This
And
is
even more, it's more related to the acting of the voice in cabaret, not to the singing of the cabaret. Because this actress, this Zehmer, this Albertine Zehmer, he always didn't sing anything. He acts it, he performs it, everything. She had performed before the same Pierrot Lunaire from the same Giraud with all other music. She didn't like it. And for that, he commissioned for Schoenberg another manner of singing. This is the difference. Not it's different from Humperdinck, for example. Humperdinck don't use it Sprechstimme, no, and don't use it Sprechgesang. And I think Schoenberg didn't put it clearly Sprechgesang in the score because he was not very sure about it. What's the difference means? Even after the future, she throw it for the future, for intending, for the understanding of it in the future. I think it's a really extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary invention, different thing from everything in his time. That's my opinion.
Any other question? Oh, Professor Severin Neff's question. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
You're muted. Yeah.
How's this? Good?
Yeah, okay.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. And I want to ask you, have you ever heard the Austrian actor Alexander Moise? He was M-O-I, I'll say this, M-O-I-S-E. And he was a friend of Berg. And he was an Italian by birth. Mm-hmm. But then he learned German incredibly. And he's on YouTube. I guess Y-S-S-Y. And he does a form of a Sprechgesang and Sprechstimme that Schoenberg heard. And many of the Austrians, there's a woman, Regina Busch, she's yes, I asked her, where did the Sprechstimme come? Because I'm an American, you know, I'm not part of that culture. And she listed that particular person, that actor, because Berg knew him so well, and Schoenberg heard him at the Theater an der Wien. So I'm just adding that not to discredit what you're saying, that maybe Schoenberg's was more original, but definitely, and what Professor, please forgive my pronunciations of all your names because I don't know any, but yes, that he mentioned, you know, how the influence of the Austrian theater. Well, I think you're both right in a certain way. And that's what makes Schoenberg special, you know, the kind of hanging on, but not really. And this is another instance of it. Yes, he heard the Austrian theater. Yes, he liked Moise, and he went to the theater with Berg. But then maybe he did certain different things with it himself that gave he always said, for a composer, you need a fingerprint. That was the metaphor that he used. And so that maybe more of the fingerprint came in. But I would go with what Regina says. And if you send me an email, I'll try to find her old email, because she listed some people with Sprechgesang, some even who went to Hollywood. So I'll give you a list of those if you're interested. But that actor Moise is really quite special.
In the thing. I think that the most important thing is the fact is Schoenberg was in the middle of certain transformations in his time, not only the musical language, but also the arts transformations and literature, and especially political transformations, made him the the radar of his time. I think that's the difference, the great difference in all this kind of thing, because it's the theaters or the cabarets or the operettas in Austrian operettas also, and all this experimentation of all kinds in all over the places. But Schoenberg, the important difference for me is the systematic use of this in a work of art, a closed work of art, so structured as Pierrot Lunaire. For me, this is thinking of the architecture of this and the Sprech, Stim or Gesang, whatever, makes in the structure of the work, complementing him and molding it is the most important thing, I think, because Schoenberg was a visionary in some things, and this is one of the most visionary works of this work in let's say before all the transformations after him, and he provoked it. In that, I am sure.
One thing I think to support your point is the counterpoint in the piece, that there's the canons and there's the fugues. And I guess Walter said this morning, he was showing the first quartet, and you get, can I say, perpetual canons in those. And you get the canon and you get the fugue. I'm not saying out of a clear blue sky, but they certainly weren't in the miniatures. And there was imitation, certainly, in Book of the Hanging Gardens, but nothing to that extent. And in terms of systematizing, some people feel that, and I do, kind of the Netherlanders' influence. He was very into the Dutch, he loved, people forget, but it's written in style and idea, that one of the great composers for him was Josquin.
Josquin, yeah.
Yes. From the Renaissance. And
but for all of them, the Renaissance was emulous.
Well, the number of canons that he wrote, both the riddle ones that he, what can I say, got solutions for, or he did a lot of double mirror canons. This was right before his turn to 12-tone music in 1922. And then he did another one in 1928 for the Concertgebouw to thank them for their 40th anniversary, even though they had a whole fight about whether there was a second performance of Gurlieder. But the whole idea of this incredible virtuosity of the canon. So I shouldn't speak about this. I'm just going to put parenthetically, talk to Bob Morris, because he's quite canon crazy, okay? But that was a very, very crucial thing for him. And in terms of mathematics, which I don't know, as you know, I made that very clear. But I think that in terms of calculating the relationships within the complex canons or the structure would be a tremendously valuable thing for theory. I've been trying to struggle with that. I'm doing the counterpoint writings. And there was a theorist, Siegfried Dehn, and nobody's heard of Dehn, D-E-H-N, but Wagner studied counterpoint with him, and Clara Schumann's father got her to Dehn. And he was, if you read his text, he actually talks about how you put together the given consonances on the downbeats. He talks too about, and Schoenberg mentions this too, he was very engaged by those canons because the pitches didn't do tonal voice leading. In other words, they could fly in a different way. Like think of Phrygian cadence, the leading tone, for something for Schoenberg, usually if you're teaching strict counterpoint of tonal nature, if you're an E minor type thing, this D would go down to C before you could, the C sharp, D sharp could enter. But of course, in the Phrygian mode, it flies to E all the time. So these types of ideas, and they're modal, and people don't, I think, give enough credit to that. So back to Pierrot, you know, I wish I could tell you the person who said it was Netherlandish, you know, the exact quote, and I can't remember. I'd have to look it up in my work. But I think that that's another kind of venue to make your point on the systematizing, because nobody can ever question that. So.
I have just to finish. I have the idea that the systematic use and the symmetrical vision of words is very tight to his religion in Schoenberg. It's very tight to the Jewish tradition, because in all texts that he was very linked to this text and to this practice, as we know. So the symmetry in texts, the symmetry of gematria, which I mentioned, and something like this, always made him think that this is perfection. The perfection is along the symmetry is also, which is up is the similar which is down. So you can make this like the triangle as the perfect symbol of this, God and the sons, and because of this, he always privileged the two great disciples, Berg and Weber, I think, because this is a triangle, and the triangle influenced each other in all ways. So, in the Pierrot, the idea of systematic use that I think so is because the number of things that are planned, and the aim of the composer especially to make people hear these things, canons, inversions, figurations, and symmetry as language, and not as technique. This is the great difference and the great geniality of this composer in his time. This is my point. I am already working on this.
Well, that's good. Well, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Severinev, the audience on YouTube are asking for you to write here the name of you have mentioned here, because they don't know how to write their name. Can you spell that on the chat so we can put there?
To spell, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
The interpreter, I think, the Moashi.
Yeah. Yes.
The what? The temp. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I know, but we've had fires in California. The what?
I'm sorry. There's a chat function at Zoom. You can type there the names. Then Daniel will collect and send to YouTube.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Wait a minute. Let's see. Now, where do I hit that so my name?
Just press chat.
Open up a chat over your right side, and written it down in the type message.
Okay.
There's a text down there. Type message here, and you type that.
Oh, okay. So I have to turn that off and then type it?
No. It's not necessary to turn off.
Oh.
Just type it. Just type it in the place, that place there.
It's a button in the right, on the left of screen sharing. For share screen.
Yeah. Okay, where it says chat?
Chat.
Chat. The word chat, yes.
Okay. And
now you can write.
Okay.
There you can write the name, yeah.
You're under search, I write my name?
No, the name you mentioned before, the
Moishi.
Yes, it's this name.
I can't, I don't know where you are, but I'll spell it again. Moissey. I think it's EY or possibly Y, because I haven't looked at it. Wait.
Okay.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
but I'll send you an email if I that's exact. It might be
Okay.
just UI, but he's on YouTube, and it's remarkable. He's doing aerochronik.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So I will share my screen because we have other questions from the audience. Let me just share here. Okay. So first, some people has some comments on all you. Felipe Defenso Martins said that it was very interesting. Also, Karol Gubernikov. Marcos Lucas has a congratulation for Professor Carlos Almada. Professor Karol Gubernikov has said that she loves the way Professor Menezes understood the dramatic of Schoenberg. And Nilson Nogueira is also happy with all presentations. So now we have some questions, but there are for Professor Carlos Almada. The first one is from Leo Labrada. He's asking about how the boundaries of perception, low-high similarity are defined.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if I understand the question. The perception is not in question in my research perception, but and similarity is range in my model range from 0 is no similarity, complete contrast, to 1 is total identity, and so it's a real number ranging from 0 to 1 similarity. This is calculated by using algorithms that compare the matrices of attributes. So the algorithms returns a number. Eventually, this number does not correspond to our intuition about similarity. I'm correcting constantly. I'm trying to correct the algorithms to give a number, a more precise number, but it is considerably efficient, this system. So low similarity.
I think he has a problem on his internet. I didn't listen your last words. Everyone have the same problem?
Yeah.
So can you repeat the last part of your?
He's back. He's back.
I will read it. Oh, are you hearing me now? Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
So I
think
He's frozen again. Yeah.
Yeah, we cannot listen this. So it's so sad.
Maybe Daniel, you could switch to another question.
Yes, I'll do that.
Back.
Yeah, the second question were for him, but I will do the last one for everyone here. Professor Marcos Lucas asked about, in the field of sound exploration, in terms of instrumentation orchestration, you means, how would you access the contribution of Schoenberg and his pupils? Is addressed to anyone from the round table. So feel free to speak about it.
Well, I can speak about what the manuscripts say about orchestration, if that's okay. Schoenberg had an idea, as we know from his settings of Bach chorales in 1922, in that era, that he changed the orchestration so that they showed the relations of motives. Possibly, you know, what Professor Almada was talking about, you know, that these kind of the differences. And he believed that that orchestration wasn't just color. It had to show the structures, whether they're symmetric or not, in a kind of very clear hierarchy to shape the form of the piece. And he wanted to teach this to Berg. Now, I have not seen these documents because, you know, I haven't been working on this. But at the Austrian National Library, if anybody's in Vienna or wants to talk to people there, there is the Alban Berg collection. And in it, there's early orchestrations of Berg, of Beethoven sonatas, with Schoenberg's corrections. And this shows certain of this whole idea of bringing structure into the whole idea of color and timbre. And I think that there has been some work on it. I think Ulrich Kramer wrote a little bit about it, Ulrich Kramer, but anyway, that's kind of open. The document I did, the Zusammenhang, Kontrapunkt, Instrumentation, Formenlehre, well, the Instrumentation mentions this and talks about that orchestration is composition. And that's, so it's wedding the two. I suppose, you know, but this is in a very different philosophy, you know, like in the 1950s where, you know, Babbitt or somebody is serializing their timbres, okay? That's a whole different concept. This is still done, shall we say, from scratch, not from a kind of setting a particular kind of operation in motion. It's done from the old 19th century organic point of view and how you want to shape or form. So I think that's about what I can say. I think other people here can speak to Klangfarben melody probably better than I can, some of the composers, you know.
We have, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, we have just 5 minutes to finish the session. So if you want to say something, I would like just to say to the audience that you can type your question, your further question for Congresso at musmat.org, and we can address for each one that presented here, and we can intermediate this conversation. If you have any further question, just email us of these, and it can just take you to with the author and discussions. So you have 5 minutes for any other commentary of the people here. So you can say, Professor.
I would like to talk very shortly about some aspects concerning the Klangfarben melody. I see that according to my view, there is an enormous difference between the Klangfarben melody as Schoenberg thought and made in praxis, particularly with Farben, the third piece of the orchestral piece of Opus 16, and Webern's Klangfarben melody, because Webern was very radical in the sense that not only the same sound changed the color, as the chord, the main chord is not the only one, but this is the main chord of the Farben piece of Schoenberg. But also different sounds have also different sound qualities in the orchestrations, for instance, of Schubert or of Bach, for instance. There is a kind of difference and a kind of radicalization in the hands of Weber concerning the principal idea of Klangfarben melody. And another very short commentary about Sprechgesang, still about Sprechgesang. I think there is an intention of Schoenberg to make the words more understandable with Sprechgesang. And it's strongly related with a text of Schoenberg, the relationship between text and music. The text is a very important text of the same year of Pierrot Lunaire, 1912, where Schoenberg says that after many years of not concerning the poems of Leda that he listened to along years, he intended to read finally the poems and concluded that the understanding of the poems didn't contribute to anything to understand better the music. And that was a commentary in the text that was revolutionary, because everyone thought in the whole history of music that the words are understandable in the songs, and sometimes they are not. They are not, and Schoenberg was the first one to say that, and to say maybe that the comprehensibility of the words are not the most important thing in the song. That's a crazy idea that Schoenberg wrote in 1912, and it was related to the invention of Sprechgesang. That maybe was the intention, consciously the intention of Schoenberg, through the cabaret, to make words more understandable. That's a very complex.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think of the beginning of the Jakobslieder? Because the whole chorus there, when you listen to it, he emphasizes all of the words. Say you had a vowel like ein and I, and there was like one vowel that went through the whole chorus, you know, like the word look or something, and then they would repeat. And after a while, because the how can I say, the registration of it, it's close, so that then you just keep hearing look, 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 and then finally you hear it so much you internalize it as a pure sound. That's the best instance, much more so than Pierrot, that I can remember. But it's an amazing chorus, the very beginning of it, and so that the word and then the repetition of it, you know, with the way the counterpoint works, that, yeah, you don't really know, but the people are in pain. I mean, that's the very lowest part. And then the soul, of course, transcends throughout the whole piece. But that really, you know, what you said, as we say, hits the nail on the head about the sound of the Sprechgesang, you know, just for me anyway, I can't say for everybody, but in that chorus.
Maybe there is also a conflict for Schoenberg himself, because it's curious and symptomatic that the Jakobslieder remained unfinished.
I would say, if I may, I would say that in Jakobslieder, in other words, Ode to Napoleon, for instance, I would make a metaphor. Maybe Schoenberg wanted to make a Klangfarbenwort, because in the Pierrot, you're right, the comprehensibility of the words flow are really an aim of it. But Schoenberg would not have the problem or the intention to ascribe in the score notes with the note, with this new graphic notes, but notes specifically, really notes. Instead of another writing that he used in other places, which simply the rhythm or otherwise. But he wrote notes. And why he wrote notes in Pierrot Lunaire? This is a very great problem in the head of Schoenberg. The borderline you mentioned is a very great idea, I think. Borderline between speech song
the profile, and the profile.
Yeah, but the profile
mentioned in the structural functions of harmony. When he quotes the profiles of the.
Sorry for interrupting, but we have a concert right now in our schedule.
Okay.
So So we could talk this. For hours
Just
and
a
hours.
correction. The mention of the profiles is in no Tratado de Harmonia, de
Harmonia.
Composição. Fundamentals of Composition.
Fundamentals of
Not the
Composition. Yeah.
structural. Fundamentals of Composition.
Yeah.
Sorry, Daniel.
Okay.
No problem. I would like to thank you again, Professor Carlos Almada, Professor Menezes, and Professor Achille Picchi, and also Professor Severine for this stunning conversation. It was very good to have you here in our conference. So now we're going to have a concert in a different link on YouTube. You can see the link on the description of this video if you are watching this on YouTube. So it starts on 6 p.m. You see there the concert for piano piece. Okay. So see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Abraço, Flor. Obrigado. Abração. Abraço, Liduino. Obrigado. Prazer te ver.
Obrigado. Parabéns, excelente trabalho. Você e Flor e Almada arrasaram.
Thank you, Ms. Neff. Mrs. Neff.
Thank you.
for it. Obrigado, Daniel. Carlos Almada, bravo.
Abraço.
Abraço.
Prazer.